Now, we talked about all that sort of rationing that had gone on during the war, and obviously before that, even the Depression, not rationing. People just didn't have the money to buy stuff. So if you take the Depression plus World War II's rationing, all of that pent-up consumer demand is going to be unleashed into the late 40s, early 1950s. And what we think of as the 1950s prosperity is different from what we've seen in, let's say, the 1920s prosperity, because so many more people are actually sharing in this rising standard of living. Between 47 and 60, the average income for the working class increased as much as it had in the previous half century. And I think most importantly, more and more blue-collar Americans, especially automotive and steelworkers, moved into the middle class. Now, it's important to understand the role that the government played in helping create that middle class. Because actually, when the war was still going on in 1944, I can't help but think that in 1864, before the war was actually, Civil War was over, they created the Freedmen's Bureau. 1944, before the war was over, they create what's known as the GI Bill, okay? And the reason that they do this, the government does this, is they're really worried about the influx of all of these veterans that are going to come into the civilian workforce, and they think there's not enough jobs that would create unemployment, so they create a way to actually have these veterans coming home not go right into work, okay? Now, the GI Bill is incredibly wide-ranging in how it helps post-war America. It's an entire package of benefits that technically gave unemployment pay for a year if you didn't have a job. It went away if you got a job. It gave preference to those applying for federal government jobs to veterans, okay? It gave loans for home construction or starting a business. Now, it also gave access to government hospitals, but most importantly, it gave these generous subsidies for education. And not only did 5 million veterans buy homes with the assistance of the GI Bill, where you could basically get a mortgage with no down payment, almost 8 million veterans took advantage of this like $15 billion in GI Bill benefits to attend college or job training programs. Now, it's really important to understand that if you put those 8 million men in college or job training as opposed to right into work, not only does it help because you don't have unemployment, actually once those people get those skills, they're going to be ready for in the early 1950s when sort of the economy explodes. So it's just this perfect sort of alignment between skilled men coming out of college and industry really picking up in the 1950s. However, African Americans are not able to really access, or I should say enjoy the same benefits. They didn't get to go to white colleges. And if they did go to white colleges, there was often major discrimination there, where they couldn't play in the sports teams or attend social events or be in fraternities or sororities. They also couldn't buy homes in white neighborhoods with, the government benefits. And although women did get, the GI Bill benefits, white women, there were so few of them ultimately that you really saw sort of this, generous help being given to men and not women, and really created even more of a wage gap overall. Now, when we talk about where many of these middle-class families are moving, it's going to be the suburbs. And many of these suburbs exist in the sort of new residences, new developments, often in what we know as the Sun Belt states. Those of you in human geo certainly have heard that before. So, from Arizona, California, in the Southwest, all the way sort of Florida, all the way through to Texas and the Southeast. Now, when you have this new highway system that people can get there, as well as air conditioning, it's really going to be appealing to live in these, warmer climates. Now, people are going to flock to the suburbs in part because you get this freedom. You're not so, constrained in the crowded city, but you also get family security. You've got this nice house and a nice yard within distance of a city, so you can enjoy the city without having to live in the city. The good life included big house, big yard, big lot, a car or two cars. And so the suburbs are going to grow way faster than cities. And one man who really capitalized on this is a New York developer named William Levitt. And so between 47 and 51 in Long Island, only 40 miles from New York City itself, he built almost 18,000 small homes. Very, very sort of cookie cutter. Not even 1,000 feet, 750 square feet. You had 2 bedrooms, and ultimately, usually like 1 bath, to lower middle class people. And he believed that he was sort of making the American dream by doing this. this first planned community they called Levittown actually had everything. It had schools, swimming pools, shopping centers, sports fields. However, sort of almost like Pullman Town back in the day, there was, they controlled everything in many ways. So it was uniformity and conformity. The houses only came in 3 different colors, which is 2 more colors than those early Model Ts originally came in. And they only had 3 different styles. They all sold for just under $7,000 with no down payment for veterans. They had the exact same floor plan and accessories. Trees were planted every 28 feet. Homeowners were required to cut their grass once a week and prohibited from hanging laundry outside to dry during the weekend. So again, you're living in the suburbs, not the cities. Don't act like you still live sort of in the poor cities, was the message. Now, Levitt and other suburban developers like him created a lily-white community outside of these black cities. So we really were seeing the white flight that we had certainly talked about with the Babbitts back in the 1920s. Now, initially, in order to basically get into Levittown, there was an exclusion in the contract for anybody who was not white. Now, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in a case called Shelby v. Kramer in 1948 that such racial restrictions were not allowed. However, in the end, people still got around it. I mean, in 1953, 5 years after the case, Levittown had 70,000 people living in it and not a single African-American resident. So some of this is going to certainly contribute to the civil rights movement, which we'll start studying next week. Now, also studying next week when we talk about not just the African-American civil rights movement, but the women's rights movement, during the Second World War, we have our whole idea of the Rosies of the world. Millions of women going traditionally male factory jobs and the mills. After the war, almost a good chunk of those women go home, to be sort of, your classic wife and mother and happy homemaker. Now, we have this image of these tree-lined suburban streets and kids riding their bikes in beautiful neighborhoods and women devoted to their husbands. And certainly that is not just sort of the stereotype. During the 50s, the U.S. marriage rate reaches an all-time high. The average age of women getting married is 19. There's a social pressure on teenage girls to get married really quickly. And if a woman isn't married or engaged by her early 20s, they think she's going to become like an old spinster with cats. And, it's interesting to know that, most women that did go to college, many of them dropped out because they got married before they got a degree. Now, it's important to realize that, yes, while it sounds like this, cult of domesticity where everyone's still working at home, there still were many women working, but just out of necessity. So they comprised in 1950 about a third of the workforce. Now that's going to rise throughout the decade. So yes, there is, this idea that women are working at home, but there's still women who need to work. And again, many of them are working in what we, have called the pink collar world, clerical positions, secretaries, bank tellers. Less than 15% are actually in a professional capacity. Yes, teachers were considered professional, nurses, accountants, social workers. Fewer than 4% were attorneys, 6% physicians. So again, women are working, but certainly not in the most valued professions in society. Now, what were women doing? Well, we have to really look at this whole idea of the child-centered 50s. And so you're going to have women having babies at numbers that they've never seen. Men came home from war. So really starting in 1946, we're going to see this baby boom. Now, baby boom, my parents being part of it, were part of, as I have referred to it in the past, like this, snake eating like a gazelle. You see this huge sort of mass moving from one part of the snake to the other. They're going to see a huge surge in demand for diapers and washing machines and baby food. And then you're going to see basically a whole new infrastructure that's going to need to be built in terms of schools, and teachers, and ultimately after that, many of these schools are going to have to be closed because they just don't have as many people. It's going to be a huge part of that 1950s economic boom, particularly around, novelties like toys and gum and records and clothes and the like. Now, the fact that so many women are home having kids really changes societal attitudes. And there's this famous issue of Life magazine, one of the most popular magazines in America at the time, in 1956, describing sort of the ideal middle-class woman. And again, 32 years old, quote, pretty and popular, living in the suburbs, of course. She's a housewife with 4 kids, She's been married at 16, so now, by this point, she's been married 16 years. She's an excellent wife and mother, volunteer in the community. She manages the home. She really prefers her marriage and child rearing to working. She makes her own clothes, hosts a dinner party, sings in the church choir. All of this is the image that we're going to see rebelled against in the women's rights movement, and we're going to see it really criticized in a book by a woman named Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique, which is really the Bible of the women's rights movement. Now we're going to get to what I did my junior year English term paper on, the book called On the Road, which was really considered the Bible of the Beat Generation, written by a man named Jack Kerouac. Now, there's a small but highly visible and controversial group of young writers, mostly, but you got poets and painters and musicians who are rejecting this consumer culture and really sort of all the sort of conformist expectations of middle-class life in the 1950s. Now, the term beat, some people thought it was like upbeat and even beatific, which means like almost saintly, or being the term, to be on the beat, as we saw in jazz music at the time. But other people sort of thought that being beat implied a weariness or being exhausted or beaten down. And so you see sort of both of those ideas within the beat generation. The biggest name you have to know, a name that you might see on the AP test, but you should just know for life, is in fact Jack Kerouac. Also big names, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Neil Cassidy, Gary Snyder. These people rebelled against the sort of conventional literary and artistic expression, and they hoped to be more outrageous and sometimes even criminal. They were pretty much a male group, and they were quite risk-taking. They really embraced the spontaneity and raw energy. They were definitely into alcohol and definitely into drugs and sexual excess. They wrote about it. They talked about it. Many of them were actually gay or bisexual, and that was a large part of what made them sort of seem deviant at a time where homosexuality was not certainly accepted, or I should say growing in acceptance over the course of the second half of the 20th century, but still not very accepted. Now, Kerouac's and the other beats were trying to change consciousness. They weren't, in fact, trying to actually address social ills, and that's important, because they had some pretty far out ideas, but they weren't necessarily trying to change policy. At the end, what they were really about was sort of this searching for an authentic self in an age that they thought was absorbed in consumerism and conformism and anti-communism. In many ways, and again, I know I'm giving away where have we seen this before, but very much a commentary on the 1950s as the lost generation was in the 1920s. Now, one other key piece of controversy, certainly in culture at that time, came about in the mid-1950s with a young man named Elvis Presley, who I know you've heard of, becomes the king of rock and roll. And what's interesting here is that not just his voice, but really his sort of gyrations that he did famously, Elvis the Pelvis, as he was criticized, because this new sound that in many ways he had, people said, growing up in Mississippi, he really borrowed from the blues in terms of African-American music. And so you sort of combined what he did with his body and his lyrics and the sound, and people said, this is just all about sex. And cultural conservatives were distraught, and certainly saw him as, the beginning of the end of civilization. And you saw Roman Catholic priests that said, this is just a symptomatic of the degeneration and dishonesty of American teenagers. And in fact, patriots said playing rock and roll is part of sort of this communist plot to corrupt America's youth. Yet in the end, rock and roll becomes incredibly popular, not just in the 50s, but certainly in the 60s as well, because it gives teenagers this sort of, self-conscious belonging to this group that didn't really have, a hierarchy. Really was, people were brought together on sort of equal terms. Now, what's interesting is, just as the car plays an important role in sort of teenage independence in the 20s, and certainly it will, because you're going to have a proliferation of cars. If people had one car in, the 20s, they're going to have two cars in the 50s, rock and roll sort of has that independence and freedom idea for teenagers in the 50s. And that is the end, my friends.